The night an entire Civil War battalion disappeared without a trace was not marked at first by cannon fire or clashing sabers or the thunder of horses across a burning field, but by something quieter, something stranger, something that crept into the air like a whisper that could not be silenced. And though the soldiers who marched along the dirt road thought themselves hardened by the months of blood and fire behind them, none of them could shake the uneasy stillness that seemed to cling to the woods they were passing through, woods the locals avoided and spoke of in hushed tones, woods that had names on old maps that no one used anymore, names scratched out as though erased from memory itself. And the battalion, 600 strong, marched that night under the command of Colonel Jameson Hale, a man whose eyes seemed always fixed forward, never betraying fear. Though even he admitted in his private journal that the men whispered of strange sights as they pressed deeper into those trees. And it was a curious thing, for these soldiers had survived battles that painted rivers red, they had walked among shattered towns where smoke clung for weeks, and yet something about this road seemed heavier on their hearts than any battlefield had been, as if war itself was a smaller terror than what waited between the gnarled branches arching above them, branches so thick they blocked out much of the moonlight and left the night in half-darkness. And the air, though summer-sweet when they first set out, grew colder the deeper they marched, not the crisp chill of autumn but a damp, breath-stealing cold that seemed to rise from the ground itself, and Private Ellis, the youngest among them, could not help glancing back every few steps, swearing that he heard more footsteps than their column should have made, and though Corporal Duncan hushed him, warning that such talk would unsettle the line, Duncan himself tightened his grip on his musket, for he too had noticed shadows moving where no torchlight reached, and the only sound beyond their own trudge was the occasional cry of a night bird that always seemed to come from the same spot no matter how far they marched, as though the forest itself had only one voice and it followed them along the road. And still Colonel Hale pressed them forward, his command steady, his posture erect upon his horse, yet his jaw clenched tighter when a mist began to rise. At first like smoke trailing from unseen fires, then thickening, until it crawled across the road, curling around boots, swallowing legs, rolling higher until men vanished waist-deep in white, and the fog was so heavy that sound itself seemed stolen away, the clink of gear and the shuffle of feet muffled as though the battalion had been wrapped in cotton, and Hale ordered the men to close ranks, to hold tight, but even his voice seemed strained, and though they tried to obey, the line began to bend and ripple as men lost sight of the comrades before them. And somewhere near the center of the column, the drummer boy Samuel Pike lost track of his captain's back, calling out but hearing only his own voice echo oddly in the fog. The echo twisted, as though it came from ahead and behind him both, and when he beat his drum for courage, the sound thudded flat, swallowed instantly, as though the mist allowed no rhythm, no music, no order to survive within it. And that was when the first disappearance was noticed, not by cry or scream, but by absence. For when Sergeant Morton turned to check his men, he found that 2 of them were gone, vanished between one breath and the next, their places empty, their rifles gone with them, as if they had been erased, and he shouted, but no answer came, and the fog pressed closer still, and the soldiers felt not only fear but a strange weariness, a heaviness in their limbs as though each step drained their strength. And some swore they heard whispers just beyond the white veil, words in no tongue they knew, words that slithered through the ear and chilled the marrow, and one by one more men faltered, reaching for comrades who were no longer there, reaching for shadows that slid away like smoke, and though Hale called for them to stand firm, his own horse grew restless, snorting and stamping, refusing to move, its eyes rolling white, and suddenly the colonel realized he could not see the front of the line anymore, nor the rear, only pale faces fading into fog. And for the first time in all his campaigns his hand trembled on the hilt of his sword, for he knew with a cold certainty that they were not alone, that something ancient and unseen walked with them in that mist, something that fed not on blood but on presence itself, erasing men like ink washed from parchment, leaving no trace, no sound, no struggle, and though the battalion pressed on, each step forward felt less certain, as though the road beneath them shifted or disappeared altogether, and in that shifting the truth dawned, slowly, terribly, that this was no ordinary march, that this was a descent, not into enemy territory, but into a place outside maps, outside memory, a place that had waited for them since long before the first shot of the war. And as Hale tried to rally his dwindling men, shouting words he could no longer hear himself speak, the fog swirled tighter, swallowing his horse to the neck, swallowing the flags and rifles, swallowing the very sense of direction until up and down blurred, and then even Hale's own hand, raised before his face, faded pale into white, leaving him staring into emptiness where flesh should be, and it was then he understood why the locals never walked this road, why they erased its name, why they whispered of lights and shadows, for this was not forest nor battlefield but a threshold, and the battalion, his battalion, 600 strong, had crossed it, unknowingly. And though history would later wonder where they went, whether deserters or captives or victims of some forgotten skirmish, the truth was simpler and stranger. They had been taken, quietly, steadily, without blood or body left behind, taken into the mist that thickened around them now like the closing of a door, and as the last flickers of lanterns winked out, and as the final sound of boots upon earth faded into nothing, the road stood empty beneath the stars, the forest hushed as though it had never known footsteps at all. And by dawn there would be no sign of 600 men, no colonel, no drummer boy, no muskets nor horses, only silence, only an emptiness that the wind could not fill. And yet if one listened closely, some swore, even years later, that faint echoes drifted on the night air, the thud of a drum swallowed in fog, the whisper of men still marching, still lost, still searching for a road that no longer led anywhere. And it was this silence, this emptiness, that marked the beginning of the tale. A tale that would spread in rumor and fear, a tale that would become the mystery of the night. An entire Civil War battalion disappeared without a trace, and it was only the beginning, for the place that swallowed them was not content with 600 souls, and those who came searching, those who asked too many questions, those who lingered too long near the edge of those woods, would come to learn that the mist remembers, the mist hungers, and the mist waits, always waits for the next step into its fold, the next breath it can steal, the next name it can erase. And so the story continues into a darker turning, for while the battalion had been swallowed by the mist and the earth bore no trace of their march, the world beyond those woods did not stand still, and questions began to stir among the nearby villages when dawn came and the road lay empty, for the battalion had been expected in the next town by morning, expected to rest, resupply, and continue toward the front. Yet no messenger arrived, no horsemen bearing orders, no stragglers limping in with stories of ambush or battle, only silence, and silence in war is louder than any cannon, and so rumors began to grow like weeds, carried from porch to tavern, whispered by washerwomen at the river, muttered by old men who remembered other vanishings in their youth, and though some said the soldiers had deserted, fled into the hills to escape the endless bloodshed, others swore they had been taken by something older than the war, something that lived in the woods since before men built roads. And while officers at headquarters scoffed, dismissing such talk as fear and folly, they could not ignore that 600 men had disappeared overnight without leaving a single rifle, a single horse, a single drum. And so a search was organized, led by Captain Andrew Mallory, a man known for his stubborn courage, who gathered 200 soldiers and marched toward the forest road with orders to find evidence, to bring back answers, and to silence the talk that spread like fire among the ranks. For if whole battalions could vanish without cause, what hope had an army? Yet even as Mallory's men set out, the villagers shook their heads, warning them not to linger, not to follow the same path. But soldiers follow orders, and the column pressed on, their boots striking dust that quickly turned to mud as storm clouds rolled in, though no rain fell, only a heavy pressure that pressed against their skulls, making every man feel as though he walked beneath a weight. And when they reached the edge of the woods where the lost battalion had entered, they found the ground unmarked, no hoofprints, no wheel tracks, no sign of hundreds of men, only a strange stillness in the trees, as though the forest had grown denser overnight, closing itself like a wound around the path. And though Mallory laughed at the hesitation of his men, his own hand brushed the grip of his pistol more often than usual, for he too felt the unnatural hush. And when they marched deeper, it was not long before the fog returned, not drifting lazily like morning mist, but rising sudden, curling thick from the ground as if summoned by their presence, and men muttered prayers as white walls closed around them, swallowing shapes and sounds until even Mallory's commands seemed dull, distant, carried away into some other world. And soon they too began to notice that the road beneath them felt wrong, softer, as though the earth was no longer solid. And their compasses spun uselessly, needles trembling as if drunk, and when Mallory ordered a halt, and when they marched deeper, it was not long before the fog returned, not drifting lazily like morning mist, but rising sudden, curling thick from the ground as if summoned by their presence, and men muttered prayers as white walls closed around them, swallowing shapes and sounds until even Mallory's commands seemed dull, distant, carried away into some other world, and soon they too began to notice that the road beneath them felt wrong, softer, as though the earth was no longer solid, and their compasses spun uselessly, needles trembling as if drunk, and when Mallory ordered a halt to regain formation, he found half his company missing, not through battle, not through desertion, but simply gone, men who had stood in rank a moment before now absent, their spaces empty, and the soldiers who remained drew tighter, muskets raised though no enemy could be seen, and whispers grew louder. Not from the men but from the fog itself, whispers in a language none recognized, words that slithered into ears and set teeth chattering, and Mallory, though a brave man, felt his resolve crack when his own lieutenant vanished mid-sentence, his words cut off as though swallowed, leaving only the echo of his last syllable hanging in the air, and the men began to panic, some firing blindly into the white, the shots muffled, their flashes dimmed as though the fog devoured even fire, and when Mallory tried to rally them, his horse reared violently, its eyes wide with terror, and before he could calm it, the animal bolted, galloping into the mist until the sound of hooves faded, and Mallory found himself alone, cut off from his company, though he knew they had been there moments before, and in that dreadful silence he realized the truth that had been whispered by villagers and denied by generals. The battalion had not deserted, nor been ambushed, but consumed by something unseen, something that dwelled in the fog. A hunger not of flesh but of existence itself, and as Mallory staggered forward, pistol drawn, he glimpsed shapes moving within the mist, not men, not animals, but shadows with eyes like faint coals, drifting, watching, circling, and he heard the drumbeat then, faint and irregular, as though Samuel Pike, the drummer boy of the vanished battalion, still wandered somewhere deeper, striking his drum with hands no longer flesh, guiding lost souls along a road that led nowhere, and Mallory shouted his name, desperate for a reply, but the only answer was the hollow thud of that drum, echoing, pulling him further, until he too vanished from record, and when days passed with no word, the 200 searchers were declared lost as well, and fear took root among the army, men whispering of the woods, refusing to march that way, for they said the fog was a living thing, a maw that opened for soldiers, swallowing them into silence, and no one who entered ever returned. And so the place was marked on maps not with names but with warnings inked in black. A gap where no road was drawn, and yet curiosity, that most dangerous hunger of men, did not rest, for journalists, adventurers, and wanderers came, each seeking truth or glory, each vanishing as surely as those before, and soon the legend spread beyond the war, beyond the states, carried across oceans, retold in taverns of Europe, whispered in markets of the East, the tale of 600 men and those who followed. All vanished in a single night, in a single forest, in a single breath of mist. And yet no trace, no relic, no sound, except for those who swore, when standing too close to those woods they heard footsteps marching still, the faint beat of a drum, and voices calling from beyond the veil, voices begging to be remembered, voices warning not to follow, and still, some did, and still, the fog waited, always waiting, for the next company, the next traveler, the next soul to step forward into the silence where history itself was unmade, where names were forgotten, where the living became whispers, and whispers became nothing. And so part 2 ends as the fog thickens and the story deepens, carrying us onward into a deeper unraveling, for what followed after the disappearance of Captain Mallory and his 200 men was not merely silence, nor the usual rumors that swirl in the wake of unexplainable losses, but a spreading terror that grew like a sickness, seeping into towns and camps alike. Because soldiers began to refuse any order that brought them near the haunted road, and officers found themselves powerless to enforce discipline when entire companies mutinied at the thought of marching into the mist, and so the army was forced to reroute, avoiding those woods altogether, though it cost them precious time and ground. But even this did not end the mystery, for the absence of 600 men and then 200 more could not be hidden forever, and soon the story reached newspapers. Though always softened, twisted, half denied, for who would believed that an entire battalion vanished in a single night without cannon or casualty. Who would accept that the earth could swallow men whole? Yet the rumors spread faster than truth could be managed, and so investigators were dispatched, men in plain coats with notebooks and lanterns, chosen not from the army but from among scholars, surveyors, and natural philosophers who believed reason could pierce any shadow. And these men scoffed at superstition, yet even they could not dismiss the records of disappearance, and so they came in secret, walking the road by lamplight, marking every tree, every turn, writing every sound, yet their journals would later be found scattered at the forest edge, pages soaked in dew, ink blurred by moisture, with entries that ended mid-sentence, some only half a word long, and though the lamps were discovered smashed upon the stones, not a trace of the investigators remained, as if the forest itself had consumed them, leaving only their half-formed thoughts as warning, and so the legend deepened, becoming not just a story of war but of cursed ground, of a threshold between worlds, of a place where time faltered and memory unraveled, and in taverns men told of ghostly marches seen by moonlight, pale columns drifting soundless among the trees, banners drooping, muskets glinting faint, faces hollow-eyed, as though the battalion still marched but no longer lived. And sometimes it was said the drum could be heard at midnight, not steady, not martial, but broken, a stumbling beat that echoed like a heartbeat struggling to continue, and those who followed the sound deeper into the woods never returned. And yet fascination grew as surely as fear, for mankind has never been content with mysteries, always reaching for what should be left untouched. And so after the war ended and peace returned, the story did not fade but rather flourished, drawing wanderers, scholars, and fools alike, each eager to solve what soldiers could not, and among them was Professor Elias Granger, a historian who claimed that every legend held a seed of truth, and he believed that if he traced the origin of the whispers, he might discover an explanation rooted not in superstition but in forgotten history. And so he gathered a party of students, eager young men with pens and surveying tools, and together they entered the forest road one autumn dusk, determined to chart it fully, to measure, to map, to prove once and for all that the vanished battalions had not been swallowed by spirits but by misfortune, by storm, by enemy ambush, by anything but the supernatural. Yet what they carried out of that forest, or rather what little remained to be carried out, told another story. 4 days later the students stumbled back alone, pale and trembling, unable to speak a word, their eyes fixed on horrors unseen, and Professor Granger was never among them. His fate sealed in the fog, and the students who survived never spoke again, their voices locked away as though stolen, and they lived only weeks more, wasting into husks that stared at the horizon as though seeing shadows no one else could see. And when they died, their journals were found, pages torn, words scrawled in haste, phrases like, "The road is longer than it should be," and "The mist is alive," and "Faces in the white," and one final line repeated again and again in desperate ink, "We were counted and found wanting," though none could say what it meant. And the legend shifted again, now not only a tale of vanishing men but of a sentience within the fog, a mind that weighed and judged, erasing what it did not accept, keeping what it did, though what it kept and for what purpose no one could answer. And so the sight became known among those who dared whisper of it as the Weighing Road, a name passed in secret, a name scratched in margins, a name that officials denied but feared nonetheless. And though the government attempted to wall it off, to forbid travel near it, fences were found splintered, guards disappeared, and still wanderers came, some drawn by greed, some by curiosity, and each one lost, leaving behind only fragments, scarves snagged on branches, boots abandoned in mud, journals with pages that grew damp as though the fog itself had seeped into the paper, staining words until they blurred into nonsense. And still the story grew, until mothers frightened children with it, warning them that if they strayed into the woods, the mist would count them and take them. And preachers thundered that it was hell's breath, a punishment for blood spilled in civil strife, and poets wrote of ghost battalions wandering forever in ranks unseen, marching toward a battle that never came. Yet not all believed in curses, and among skeptics was a young officer named Jonathan Crow, who had lost his brother among Mallory's men and who refused to accept superstition as answer. And so in the spring of 1871, he mounted an expedition not of soldiers but of family, neighbors, and men bound by oath, swearing that he would recover proof, a coat, a saber, a single bone if nothing else, to lay the mystery to rest, and Crow marched with fire in his heart, carrying torches, compasses, even chains to mark their path, determined that they would not vanish as others had, and at first their journey seemed ordinary, the road clear, the woods no more haunted than any other, until the torches flickered though no wind stirred, and the chains they had laid rattled, lifting from the ground as though tugged by unseen hands, and the fog came then, not creeping but rushing, rolling like a wave that drowned them in white, and Crow shouted for his men to hold fast, but their voices were already faint, carried away, until he too could see nothing but pale walls, and in that whiteness he felt a gaze upon him, vast and ancient, as if the mist itself bent down to measure his soul, and he realized then what the scribbled words had meant, that the mist counted, weighed, and found some worthy to remain, others to erase, and his heart froze as he felt himself slipping, his body dimming at the edges, as though he were being rubbed from existence, but he resisted, clinging to the chain he had laid, holding to the torch in his hand, and for a moment he thought he might survive, might break free, when suddenly the drumbeat came again, faint, steady now, like a march in the distance, and his grip loosened, his body wavered, and when he looked down he saw not hands but smoke curling where his fingers had been, and then there was nothing, only the torch clattering to earth, burning faint, and Crow was gone, his company gone, their chains still lying on the road like serpents that had slithered free of masters, their torches smoldering, yet no men to wield them, and so once more the mist had taken, and once more silence reigned, and thus the legend only grew greater, for by now it had swallowed soldiers, officers, scholars, wanderers, and kin, and still it was not sated, still it waited, and still men whispered that if you listened at night, if you dared stand at the forest's edge, you might hear the drumbeat calling, the footsteps marching, the voices murmuring, carrying us onward into the kind of tale that feels less like history and more like a wound that refuses to close, because the strange vanishing of so many men did not just echo among soldiers and grieving families, it rippled outward into the bones of the land itself, shaping how people lived, prayed, and feared, and by the years after the war's end, that stretch of forest had become a forbidden border even though no official decree could fully keep men away. And while the earlier accounts spoke of fog and whispers and men erased from one breath to the next, new accounts began to paint the mystery in stranger colors, for travelers who skirted the edges of those trees claimed that the forest itself had grown thicker, trunks leaning inward as though closing ranks, and sometimes, when the wind was low, they swore they saw shapes moving between the branches, not men, not animals, but columns of pale figures whose faces carried no features at all, blank silhouettes marching endlessly in silence. And these visions frightened the common folk into weaving new stories, saying the forest was cursed by the dead of every war the land had ever known, that the Civil War Battalion was only the latest to be claimed, and that older armies, soldiers from forgotten conflicts, even tribes who had fought centuries before, had also been swallowed by the same unseen maw, their memories stripped away until only the echo of their march remained, and those scholars dismissed this as superstition. They could not explain why maps of the region grew less reliable each year, roads twisting where once they ran straight, clearings closing with new growth that appeared unnaturally fast, paths leading nowhere, as if the very geography had become untrustworthy, and so cartographers argued among themselves, some insisting it was poor surveying, others whispering that the land resisted being measured, and into this confusion stepped a man named Reverend Silas Brand, a preacher who believed the vanishing battalions were evidence not of natural forces but of a divine judgment, claiming that God himself had erased the men for their sins, wiping their names from the ledger of the living, and he drew crowds with fiery sermons delivered at the forest's edge, pointing to the mist that sometimes rolled out across the fields as proof of wrath. Yet the strangest thing was not his words, but the way the fog seemed to thicken whenever he preached, rolling closer as though listening, and some nights, when his voice rose highest, the mist would surge over the crowd, scattering them in panic, though Silas himself always stood unharmed, his face pale, his eyes bright, and rumors began that he was marked, chosen or cursed, touched by whatever dwelled within the white, and though many avoided him, others followed, convinced he alone could speak to the mystery, and thus a small sect grew around him, men and women who entered the woods by his side, chanting prayers, carrying lanterns, and yet never all of them returned. For each time some number was missing, and when asked where The others had gone. Silas only smiled and said, "They were called," offering no further explanation, and so another layer of dread was added, for now it seemed the phenomenon did not only consume soldiers or wanderers but anyone drawn by faith, by curiosity, by hunger for answers, and the records of these years are filled with contradictions, testimonies that clash, yet all share one thread, the sense that the forest was alive in some way men could not name, an intelligence that watched, weighed, and chose, and by the late 1870s the place had become so infamous that even newspapers overseas printed stories, sometimes mocking, sometimes awestruck, and expeditions arrived not only from nearby states but from across oceans, men armed with the latest instruments of science, barometers, compasses, new chemical lamps, and they too vanished, or returned broken, stammering half-phrases, unable to stand the sight of daylight, muttering of roads that doubled back upon themselves, and voices that called in perfect unison though no mouths were seen. And from these fractured accounts grew the notion that the missing battalion had not died in any ordinary sense but had been taken elsewhere, to a parallel place, a hollow reflection of the world, where they marched still, stripped of memory, stripped of self. And this idea took hold in stories, in penny novels, in stage plays that dramatized the haunted march, and though artists exaggerated, some truth glimmered in their imaginings, for travelers swore that sometimes at night entire orchards would shake with the thud of unseen boots, and farm dogs cowered though no intruder could be found, and doors rattled to a rhythm like a military cadence, and so ordinary folk learned to bar their windows tight on moonless nights, whispering prayers until the phantom sound passed. And this cycle of terror might have continued unbroken if not for one strange occurrence in the winter of 1884, when a hunter named Jacob Renner stumbled from the forest half-frozen, carrying a rusted bayonet unlike any issued in that decade, its steel model but its shape unmistakably from the war years, and though he never spoke clearly, only muttering of endless lines, the weapon itself was proof that something lingered inside those woods, and museums vied for it, though some claimed it crumbled to dust within weeks as if it could not endure the outside world, and Renner himself wasted away soon after, eyes hollow, skin gray, until he died whispering in his sleep, his lips moving in rhythm to a drum only he could hear, and so the story deepened further, until it seemed the entire region lived in the shadow of that unseen force, and yet still men came, always came, each convinced they would succeed where others failed, each confident they would solve the mystery, only to join the silence, and by the turn of the century, what had begun as the loss of a single battalion had become a legend that stretched its fingers across generations, touching faith, science, folklore, and fear alike, until the place itself was no longer just a forest but a boundary, a place where men vanished and stories multiplied, because by the time the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the legend of the vanished battalion had grown from whispered rumor into a kind of living myth, retold in newspapers, journals, novels, and late-night conversations by firelight, yet the more it was told the less it resembled any simple story of war. For now people spoke of the phenomenon as if it were not an event that had happened once but an ongoing condition, a permanent wound in the earth where rules bent and vanished, where men stepped across a line and were never seen again. And this understanding changed how communities lived around it, shaping trade routes, shrinking farms, even dictating where towns were built. Because no one dared to settle near the road anymore, the soil there left untilled, the trees left to grow unchecked, so that decade after decade the forest swelled outward, swallowing fields that had once been open, until maps showed a dark blotch larger each year, and the people who still lived near the edge spoke of nights when they saw lights flickering in the mist, lantern glows that danced between the branches but never illuminated a human hand, and sometimes whole households were kept awake by sounds of a march passing unseen. The rhythmic beat of boots and the hollow thump of a drum, and always the noises faded into silence before dawn, leaving behind only frightened whispers and the uneasy knowledge that something vast and unexplainable lingered still, waiting. And it was during these early decades of the 20th century that the story took a stranger turn, for new technologies gave investigators fresh confidence, and teams arrived with cameras, phonographs, electrical lamps, convinced that they could capture what soldiers and wanderers had only described, and though some managed to take photographs at the forest's edge, images of pale fog, twisted trunks, shadows that seemed wrong in angle and shape, None succeeded in carrying their equipment back once they crossed the boundary. For every expedition vanished or returned empty-handed, their instruments found later at the edge, wires melted, glass shattered, reels of film fogged into blankness. As though the place itself rejected being recorded, and in this way the legend adapted to modern times, proving not just resistant to explanation but actively hostile to it, and among scientists the story gained a new nickname, the Zone of Erasure, a name whispered in lectures and written cautiously in journals, because no one wished to admit publicly to studying superstition, yet more than one respected scholar was caught traveling quietly to the site, driven by a compulsion they could not rationalize, and each time they were swallowed as surely as soldiers had been before them, leaving only fragments of notes behind, scribbled words like geography shifting, echoes of cadence, pressure in the bones, and one phrase repeated too often to ignore, the road is counting us. And though skeptics mocked this, those who studied the pattern noticed something uncanny, that the vanishings often occurred in exact numbers, 600 first, then 200, then smaller groups of 10, 20, 50, as if the phenomenon required symmetry, as if it was filling ledgers with precision, and so a darker theory arose, that the place was not random but purposeful, weighing groups, taking them in whole numbers, balancing some unseen scale, and the thought of that made even hardened officers shiver, for it meant there was intent, a cold intelligence guiding the erasures, an intelligence that did not reveal itself but always measured, always chose. And while officials tried to bury such ideas, local lore only flourished, evolving into ghost tales told to frighten children, but also into serious warnings carved into wood and stone, crosses nailed at crossroads, circles of salt poured around barns, families hanging scraps of uniform cloth as offerings to keep the marchers at bay, for they believed the vanished battalion had become not truly gone but restless, a host of pale soldiers condemned to wander the fog forever, seeking new souls to swell their number. And some said if you lingered too long at the boundary you would see them. A silent column of figures half seen, their faces empty hollows, their hands clutching weapons rusted yet sharp, their boots striking a road that no longer touched the earth, and if your eyes met theirs, even once, you would be compelled to follow, to march until your body faded into smoke and you joined their ranks, nameless and eternal. And this belief hardened into certainty after 1913, when a group of railway workers laying track nearby disappeared in broad daylight, leaving behind their tools, their lunch pails, even fresh cigarette smoke still curling in the air, yet no men to claim them, and though the company tried to suppress the story, too many witnesses had seen the fog roll in without warning, too many had heard the faint rumble like boots in the distance, and so the legend grew again, adapting, shaping itself to modern fears, and by the time the Great War erupted overseas, soldiers leaving from nearby towns carried the story with them, telling comrades in trenches of the American forest that swallowed armies, and men who faced gas and shellfire still shuddered at the thought of an enemy that did not fight but simply erased. And after the war, when veterans returned broken, some swore they heard familiar rhythms in the night winds, drumbeats that did not belong to Europe but to the haunted road back home, as if the vanished battalion followed them across oceans. And in this way the story refused to stay confined, spreading outward, weaving itself into the fabric of culture, until even those who had never set foot in the region knew of the place where men vanished without a trace. And yet the forest still stood, its mist still rising, its hunger still waiting, as though time itself could not touch it, as though the Civil War, the investigations, the railways, the wars abroad, all of it was nothing to the white silence that claimed men and memory alike, carrying us onward into. The first thing the locals noticed was that the forest no longer behaved like any other patch of wilderness, because by the 1920s and 30s the trees near the old road seemed to grow at impossible speeds, rings thickening twice as wide as an ordinary timber, trunks twisting into grotesque shapes as if they had been bent by unseen hands, and hunters who dared approach swore that animals avoided the area entirely, no birds nesting in branches, no deer tracks in the soil, only silence. Thick and watchful, and what unsettled people most was not just the emptiness but the sense that the land itself remembered, as if every vanished man had left behind not only his body but his weight, pressing into the ground until the soil grew heavy with absence. And sometimes when plows cut too close to the boundary, farmers claimed their horses stumbled as though striking unseen obstacles, yanking harnesses in terror, refusing to move forward. And these stories might have been dismissed as country superstition had it not been for the arrival of government men during the Great Depression, men in dark suits with clipboards who did not give their names, who claimed they were sent to assess land for conservation, though everyone knew they came to study the mystery, and their presence only deepened unease, for they set up strange machines that clicked and hummed, drove stakes into the ground, ran wires between the trees, and though they worked for weeks, none ever entered the fog itself, and when they departed, their equipment was left behind in crates nailed shut, never collected, as if they had learned something that made them abandon the project altogether. And in the years that followed, trespassers broke open those crates and found instruments shattered beyond repair, metal warped like wax under flame, and from that time onward locals became convinced that the place did not merely erase people but also corrupted what they carried, stripping the usefulness from objects just as it stripped the memory from men, and so it became a superstition to never take a personal belonging near the boundary, for fear it would return tainted, marked, cursed. And though these warnings were spread with great seriousness, new groups kept coming, for curiosity is a deeper hunger than fear, and so amateur historians, professors, journalists, even mystics drifted toward the forest, chasing fragments of rumor, and some claimed to find strange relics lying in the grass. Scraps of cloth too rotted to identify, brass buttons whose markings had long been dissolved, a rusted drumstick half buried in mud, and each time such an object appeared, the one who found it reported being followed afterward by odd sounds, shuffling footsteps on empty roads, faint bugle calls in the night, soft knocks on their doors when no visitor stood outside, and these hauntings grew worse until the relic was discarded, often burned or buried at crossroads. And so a belief hardened that the items themselves carried part of the curse, tethered to whatever realm the battalion had been drawn into, leaking fragments of its endless march back into the world. And though rational men sneered at this, no one could explain why those who clung to relics always withered, falling ill, their minds wandering into mutterings of cadence counts and drill commands, until they too seemed half present, eyes fixed on some road only they could see, and one by one they died, muttering names that had not been spoken in decades. Names of men recorded in old regimental rosters, names of the vanished, and thus the legend adapted again, no longer confined to the forest alone but bleeding into the lives of those who sought its traces. And by the 1940s, when a Second World War pulled young men overseas, the tale returned with sharper teeth, for soldiers who had grown up in towns near the boundary whispered to comrades that vanishing was worse than dying, that to be erased was to march forever unseen. And these whispers reached commanders who dismissed them as morale-sapping superstition, but still strange patterns appeared in letters sent home, accounts from European trenches where men claimed to hear phantom drums at night, though no drummers marched nearby, and after the war ended, some veterans refused to return to their childhood homes, confessing they could not bear to live near the place that had shadowed their dreams, a place that seemed to have followed them across oceans. And the deeper one looks into diaries and oral histories from this period, the more one finds references to the White Road, a phrase repeated too consistently to be chance, always describing a pale path glimpsed at the edge of vision, cutting through fog, calling men to step forward, and when they resisted, they woke shivering, certain they had almost been taken. And thus the story by mid-century was no longer only about a vanished battalion but about a door, an unseen threshold waiting in the mist, a place between places that swallowed whoever crossed, and to those who lived nearby this understanding brought no comfort, only dread, because it suggested the erasure was not a single act or even a repeating one but a permanent condition, a doorway that never closed. And every generation risked stumbling through, whether soldier, farmer, or child, and this dread reached a fever when in 1952 a school bus traveling a back route near the boundary was found empty by the roadside, its engines still running, its headlights cutting pale beams through morning haze. But not a single student or driver aboard, and though authorities swore later that the children were found safe in another county, carried off by mistake in a mix-up of transport, the local people never believed the explanation. For they had seen the bus themselves, doors open, seats abandoned. And they knew in their bones that 30 souls had been claimed at once, though for reasons unknown the official records covered it up, and this secrecy convinced many that the government not only knew of the erasures but had begun to conceal them, treating the phenomenon not as myth but as a matter too dangerous to admit, and so by the late 20th century the place was no longer only feared but guarded. Soldiers posted in rotating details who kept strangers from venturing close, though. Locals whispered that sometimes it was the guards themselves who vanished, their posts left empty at dawn, rifles leaning against trees, footprints leading nowhere, and so the silence grew heavier, more layered, each disappearance piling upon the last, until the forest felt swollen with loss, a vast hollow that echoed with marches no one could see, and people began to say that the land itself was turning into a cemetery without graves. An archive of those erased, yet without markers or names. And when asked what remained inside, the old men shook their heads and said only this, that once you cross the line, there is no battle, no blood, no death. Only the endless sound of boots on an endless road, a march that never ends, a cadence that carries on long after memory has rotted away. And what vanishes in there is not just men but the very record of their living, their histories dissolved, their voices gone. Leaving behind only absence, an absence so loud that whole generations have shaped their lives around avoiding it, an absence that waits still, as patient as stone, as patient as fog, as patient as hunger that has never once been satisfied, and perhaps never will. That be why the closing years of the 20th century, the disappearance of the battalion had grown beyond legend and settled into a shadowed corner of official secrecy. Because while the local people still told their stories in kitchens and on porches, the rest of the world had begun to suspect that the government itself was guarding something far stranger than folklore, and the evidence for this suspicion lay in the sudden fencing off of a vast perimeter around the forest, high chain link topped with barbed wire, gates manned by armed patrols, warning signs declaring the land a restricted research zone, though no one ever explained what kind of research required that degree of silence, and soon enough strange vehicles were seen moving in and out at night. Trucks with canvas covers, convoys that never stopped in town, and sometimes even the distant thrum of helicopters circling above the treetops, and these sights fanned the flames of speculation, until conspiracy writers declared that the vanished battalion had not been erased but transported somewhere, through time, into another dimension, or into the custody of those who controlled the secret, and such claims seemed wild until the mid-1990s, when a group of amateur investigators hiked to the edge of the restricted zone with camcorders, microphones, and cheap handheld meters, expecting nothing more than a weekend adventure, yet only two returned, pale and trembling, their footage showing hours of empty trees until suddenly the camera jolted, filling with static, followed by a glimpse of marching legs, gray trousers, boots rising and falling in rhythm, hundreds of them, and then the feed cut to black, and while skeptics argued it was staged, the survivors refused to speak further, eventually abandoning their homes, moving to other states, their lives unraveled by something they would not name, and their silence fed the belief that the battalion was still there, still marching, trapped in a pocket of reality that coexisted with ours but could not be touched. And when the millennium arrived with satellites, drones, and thermal imaging, fresh attempts were made to map the region, but every digital feed blurred when the machines crossed into the fog, signals collapsing, batteries draining in minutes, lenses fogging from the inside, as if the phenomenon reached into circuits themselves, corrupting them as easily as it had once corrupted compasses and film, and even military satellites reported strange anomalies above the region, blank patches where data returned void, a hole in the electronic eye of the sky, and yet despite decades of failure, interest only deepened. Because each generation of scientists was convinced the previous had lacked the proper tools, and so new projects were launched under names that never appeared in public budgets, but which locals glimpsed when unmarked vans rolled through their streets, their drivers silent, their windows tinted, and some whispered that the government was not trying to solve the mystery anymore but to harness it, to weaponize erasure itself, to turn disappearance into a tool. And while such talks sounded paranoid, it matched the atmosphere of the early 21st century, when secrecy grew thicker than ever, and fences taller, and the zone wider, until whole tracts of farmland were bought up and emptied, families forced to move away, their homes left to rot at the forest's edge, standing like teeth around a dark maw. And from that time forward the region acquired a new reputation, no longer a haunted wood but a forbidden zone, where trespassers vanished not only by fog but by men with rifles, and the story fractured into two layers, the old legend of soldiers swallowed by mist, and the new rumor of hidden laboratories buried beneath the trees, where scientists in white coats walked echoing halls, trying to speak with the vanished battalion, trying to bring them back or push others through, and though no proof of such places has ever surfaced, strange things began happening in towns miles away, lights flickering in every house at the same instant, radio stations bleeding with static that resolved into faint drumming, pets howling toward the forest at night, and people waking with the sensation of boots stomping across their roofs, only to find no marks in the morning. And so the impression spread that whatever had once been contained inside the fog was growing outward, seeping into ordinary life, thinning the veil between worlds until even those who never set foot in the zone felt its weight. And one chilling incident from 2008 sealed disbelief. A survey plane flying above the area transmitted a garbled final message before dropping off radar. And when search crews finally located the wreck, they found the fuselage cracked open but no bodies inside, only empty seats, safety belts still clasped, the cabin reeking of ozone, as if the passengers had simply been pulled from their places mid-flight, erased in air as cleanly as soldiers on the ground. And this new disappearance, witnessed and recorded in the age of satellites, could not be dismissed as old war lore, and though the official report cited mechanical failure, leaked fragments of black box recordings told another story, muffled sounds of many feet marching in the background of the cockpit, even as the pilots screamed, and with that revelation the legend crossed into modern terror, no longer tied to the Civil War, no longer just a mystery of history, but a living wound stretching across centuries, and every attempt to solve it only feeding it further, as though attention itself strengthened it. And in coffee shops and internet forums the theory began to circulate that the battalion had never truly disappeared at all, but had multiplied, recruiting endlessly from those who followed, becoming an army without nation, without name, an army that marched forever in fog, waiting for the moment when the barrier thinned enough to let them spill out across the world. And this thought filled ordinary people with dread, because it suggested the story was not ending, not fading into folklore, but gathering, waiting for its next step. And those who live near the restricted zone today still say that on certain nights, when the air is heavy and the horizon glows with storms, you can hear the ground trembling, a vibration like thousands of boots striking in unison, not fading but drawing closer, as though the march that began with a single regiment in a war long past has never stopped, only grown louder, pressing ever nearer to the present moment, until one day there will be no boundary left, no fence tall enough, no secrecy deep enough, to hold it back. The uneasy certainty that fences, guards, and secrecy could no longer hold back the mystery became undeniable when, for the first time in living memory, someone stepped out of the fog alive, staggering into the headlights of a passing truck on a rural road in 2015, clothes soaked with dew, skin gray and clammy, eyes glazed like smoked glass, and though at first the truck driver believed he had struck a vagrant, it quickly became clear this man had emerged from the forest, because his uniform, though tattered and rotted, was unmistakably military, cut in a style no modern army used, its buttons dull brass, its insignia nearly eaten away, yet still bearing faint marks that matched those of the Civil War regiment recorded as vanished. And when the driver tried to speak with him, the stranger's words spilled in broken cadence counts, half-whispered drill commands, mutterings of names lost for a century, until he collapsed in the dirt, convulsing, his lips frothing, and by the time emergency responders arrived he was nearly unrecognizable as a living man, his body emaciated as though he had not eaten in decades, yet he breathed. And when they rushed him to a hospital under heavy guard, chaos erupted among officials, because if this was true, if even one soldier of the lost battalion had returned, the story would no longer be deniable, and so the hospital was placed under a cordon. Doctors sworn to silence, staff rotated under watch, and still rumors leaked, carried by orderlies who whispered of the man's strange condition, how his shadow seemed to flicker independent of his body, how at night the halls filled with the distant sound of marching boots though no one walked them, how cameras trained on his room fizzed into static after a few seconds, recording only the faint outline of his frame as though he was not entirely present in this world. And those who tried to question him reported that he sometimes answered in a language that matched no dialect, other times repeated the same sentence over and over. "The road does not end, the road does not end." And once, during a violent fit, he shouted in a voice far louder than his frail body should have allowed, rattling every fixture in the ward, "More are coming! This warning set panic in the hearts of those who heard it, for they wondered if he meant more soldiers were emerging or more would be taken, and within days the man's condition deteriorated into a kind of dissolution, his skin flaking like ash, his bones showing through, until in one night he simply collapsed into dust, leaving behind only the uniform and the brass buttons, which themselves blackened and crumbled when touched. As if the world could not sustain the weight of something pulled from that other place. And while officials tried to erase the incident from records, it had already spread, because dozens of witnesses had seen the convoy of vehicles that removed his remains, dozens of staff had heard the drumbeats echoing in the halls, and soon every corner of the internet lit up with speculation, some insisting it was proof the battalion was alive in another dimension, others that it was a failed experiment to weaponize the fog, and still others that it was a warning that the fog no longer held its captives but was beginning to release them. And with each theory came a deeper fear, that the silence of the past century had not meant the phenomenon was dormant, but that it was gathering strength, preparing for some larger event. This fear seemed vindicated when more sightings were reported in the years after, people claiming to see soldiers marching across highways at night, their forms translucent, their faces eyeless, or travelers swearing that their GPS devices led them down non-existent roads that faded into mist, forcing them to turn back in terror. And most chilling of all were the accounts from hikers who swore they saw campfires burning deep inside the restricted zone, faint glows that moved in lines as though belonging to whole companies on the march, and though security forces were dispatched to investigate, they returned shaken, refusing to speak of what they had found, their eyes haunted, their hair gone gray in a matter of weeks, and many resigned their posts soon after, unwilling to serve another night in the zone. The legend, once confined to dusty history and folklore, was now alive in the age of satellites and smartphones, alive in ways that terrified even skeptics, because no lens could capture what eyes saw, no recording device survived the attempt, and so the mystery remained stubbornly resistant, as if it thrived on being untold, as if secrecy was its natural state. And every attempt to drag it into daylight was punished by distortion and silence. Yet even as fear grew, there were those who were drawn to it like moths to flame, self-proclaimed explorers who live-streamed their trespasses near the fences, baiting the fog for their audiences, and some vanished on camera, their streams cutting to static mid-laugh, while others staggered out screaming, their words incoherent, their eyes blind, their minds broken, leaving their audiences shaken but transfixed. And thus the legend adapted yet again, becoming not only a ghost story and a conspiracy but also a spectacle for the digital age, a phenomenon that consumed not only bodies but attention, spreading itself wider through each retelling. Still, the most disturbing accounts did not come from adventurers but from ordinary people living dozens of miles away, who began to report dreams of marching, dreams so vivid they woke with their feet blistered as though they had walked miles barefoot, and doctors could not explain the injuries, nor the way their patients' heartbeats sometimes fell into perfect marching rhythm when measured by monitors. And when pressed, these dreamers always described the same detail: a pale road cutting through fog, stretching endlessly forward, and a drummer boy at its center, face blank, arms moving in tireless repetition, striking a rhythm that never faltered, a rhythm that pulled them forward until they woke in terror, gasping, certain that one night they would not wake at all but would keep walking into the mist. These accounts multiplied, not just in the region but across continents, until it seemed the reach of the vanished battalion had grown global, its march echoing in the minds of people who had never even heard the story before, and scholars of folklore struggled to explain how such a tale could spontaneously erupt in cultures far removed, unless it was not a tale at all but a signal, an echo bleeding into the world from whatever void had swallowed the battalion. And so the question became not whether men could still vanish into the fog, but how long before the fog itself moved outward, no longer waiting at the border of its forests but rolling across highways, across towns, swallowing not battalions but cities, not companies but nations, until the march filled every road, every horizon, and history itself was rewritten not by battles fought or treaties signed but by the silence of erasure. The endless thunder of boots in fog, when the first fingers of the mist rolled past the tree line and slithered across paved roads into the outskirts of towns, there were no fanfares or alarms to mark it, only a morning where shopkeepers opened their doors and found a white haze clinging to the streets like smoke, thick in some alleys, thin in others, yet carrying no scent of fire, and though most dismissed it as a natural fog, a seasonal quirk of weather. There was unease in the way it refused to burn away beneath the rising sun, hanging instead in stubborn curtains that seemed to shift against the wind, and that unease deepened when people began to complain of strange sensations while walking through it. An odd weight in the chest, a ringing in the ears, a faint percussion beneath the soles of their shoes as if the asphalt itself carried vibrations of marching feet, and though doctors wrote the symptoms off as nerves or suggestion, too many felt them for coincidence. And within days pets refused to leave their homes, barking and hissing at invisible threats in the haze, and lights flickered every time the fog pressed close, as though electricity itself recoiled from its presence. And then came the first disappearance outside the zone, not a soldier or reckless trespasser but a grocery clerk named Helen Marsh, who stepped into the mist while carrying bags for a customer and was never seen again, her groceries scattered on the sidewalk, eggs broken, milk soaking into the curb, and though witnesses swore she simply dissolved. Police reports listed her as missing, no mention of fog, yet neighbors told the story in whispers until it spread beyond the town, and panic began to simmer, for if the haze could reach their streets, then the boundary had been breached, the silence no longer contained, and the old legend of vanished battalions was not a tale of one haunted forest but a harbinger of something that could spread without end. The government responded with denials at first, insisting weather patterns explained the haze, but their actions betrayed their fear, for roadblocks sprouted overnight, checkpoints multiplied, and entire neighborhoods were temporarily evacuated, under claims of gas leaks, yet those who lived there knew the truth, because they had seen the fog creep beneath their doors, seeping through window frames, filling bedrooms in the dead of night. And with it came sounds, the muffled roll of drums, the creak of leather straps, the jangle of canteens, sounds impossible to mistake. And those who heard them awoke trembling, certain that unseen ranks stood in their living rooms, waiting. Soon videos leaked despite censorship, shaky phone footage showing alleys where pale figures moved in formation before fading into whiteness, or highway dashcams where endless lines of shadowy forms crossed the lanes without pause, their faces featureless, their bodies half-transparent, and while skeptics cried hoax, the fear became global, because every culture that watched those clips recognized something universal in the cadence, the sound of boots, the pull of an endless march, and for the first time the mystery could not be dismissed as a regional ghost story, for it had become visible in too many places at once, seeding dread into cities continents away. Reports multiplied, commuters vanishing from bus stops swallowed mid-conversation, cars found idling on highways with doors flung open and no drivers, office towers where whole night shifts never clocked out, their workstations still warm, their chairs empty. And always the fog was near, always the cameras failed, leaving only fragments, shadows, distortions, echoes of boots. Panic spread but was smothered beneath silence, for every broadcast that tried to cover it was abruptly cut, anchors replaced by official statements urging calm, and those who spoke too loudly found themselves discredited, arrested, or vanished themselves, leaving the public trapped between rumor and fear, certain something vast was happening yet denied the words to frame it. In the absence of truth, myths bloomed. Some said the battalion had multiplied into an army large enough to spill beyond its prison, others claimed the fog itself was alive, hunting, learning, and still others whispered that what was happening was not an invasion at all but a return, that the world itself had been theirs once, and we were the intruders living on borrowed ground. Communities fractured under the weight of these stories, some fleeing inland, some fortifying their towns with barricades and watchmen, though none of it mattered when the mist drifted without pattern, one night absent, the next swallowing whole neighborhoods, leaving silence so total it felt like the earth had been hollowed out. Survivors told of hearing voices calling their names in familiar tones, family members long dead, urging them into the haze, and when they resisted, the voices grew sharp, commanding, like officers barking orders, and it was this detail that terrified listeners most, because it suggested intelligence, will, and purpose behind the erasures, not random hunger but a command carried forward, a war still being fought, its soldiers still recruiting. In time the fog no longer needed to touch people directly, for its echoes began to spread through dreams again, stronger than before, pulling thousands each night into visions of the endless road, the faceless drummer, the ranks marching into forever. And more than a few never woke from those dreams, their bodies found lifeless in bed, yet their feet blistered as though they had walked miles. Hospitals filled with the broken, Governments scrambled with excuses, but ordinary people knew in their bones that the silence which began with one battalion had grown into a storm no boundary could contain, and though officials still clung to control, the people whispered a single truth to each other in fearful tones. The march was no longer in the forest, it was everywhere now, threading through streets and skies, echoing through dreams. And soon it would not be a matter of who vanished into the fog but who remained outside it, standing alone on roads grown too quiet, listening to the thunder of boots rolling nearer, knowing their turn would come. And so when the thunder of boots rolled nearer, the dread that had lingered for generations transformed into something far worse than fear, because the march was no longer confined to shadows and foggy roads but began carving itself into the very fabric of the present, rewriting reality in ways too subtle at first for most to notice, until it became impossible to deny. For whole families awoke one morning to find photographs on their mantels altered, faces rearranged, uniforms on ancestors that had never been soldiers, medals gleaming on chests that history recorded as farmers or clerks, and in libraries old regimental records swelled with new names. Men and women who had never been part of any army now listed among the vanished battalion as if they had marched away more than a century before, and though archivists burned themselves trying to disprove the documents, the deeper they searched the more contradictions they found, as if every attempt to hold the truth still only bent it further, and newspapers carried stories of living veterans who discovered their own signatures scrawled across enlistment forms dated generations earlier, their birth certificates warped, their parents' names erased, replaced by officers' titles. Until some began to whisper that the battalion was no longer satisfied with consuming bodies but now devoured identities, dragging the past itself into its ranks, and evidence of this seeped into the present with chilling clarity, because military bases across the world reported phantom drills in their barracks at night, ranks assembling, roll calls echoing with names that matched no one on record, and when the lights came on, the bunks were empty, the parade grounds bare. Yet dust hung in the air as if boots had just struck the earth by the thousands. Ordinary people were not spared either, for in crowded cities, commuters waiting on platforms swore the tunnels filled with the sound of marching long before trains arrived, and sometimes the trains did not arrive at all, their passengers erased mid-journey, their seats left warm, their belongings still clutched in empty air, and survivors spoke of watching fellow travelers dissolve into lines of soldiers, their suits and dresses replaced by tattered gray uniforms as they melted into the ranks. Eyes blank, feet moving in rhythm, vanishing into fog that seemed to rise from the ground itself, and such accounts multiplied until no one could ride without dread, yet governments still denied, insisting technical malfunctions explained the vanishings, though their trembling ministers and sleepless generals betrayed that they too had heard the marching in their dreams, that they too had found their own childhood photographs distorted by a shadowy uniform at the edge of the frame. By then the theory spread that the battalion had ceased to be a contained mystery at all, that it had merged with the present world, rewriting entire strands of time as if the past was not fixed but pliable, a road that could be repaved by the endless march, and evidence mounted when archaeologists uncovered Civil War-era bullets in deserts where no battle had ever taken place, or when children in distant countries began reciting cadence counts in languages they had never been taught, their voices eerily unified, their feet stomping in rhythm before horrified teachers who dragged them from classrooms only to find their pupils' eyes glazed, their mouths repeating the same line, "The road is endless, the road is endless," until their parents took them home trembling, unsure whether their children were possessed or merely caught in a current of history too vast to fight. What terrified even hardened skeptics most was not only the scale of the phenomena but its precision, for the fog and its phantom army did not drift randomly but with purpose, targeting military parades, war memorials, even ceremonies of remembrance, where veterans gathered to honor the fallen only to find their bugles drowned out by distant drums, their salutes mirrored by ranks of translucent soldiers whose faces blurred like old daguerreotypes, and sometimes whole honor guards disappeared mid-salute, their rifles clattering to the ground while their forms faded into the mist, leaving only the echo of boots fading towards some invisible horizon. In one unforgettable incident in 2021, a live global broadcast of a military review in a European capital froze in horror as cameras captured the parade ground splitting open with fog, half the marching units vanishing step by step, their formations melting seamlessly into others that wore uniforms centuries out of place, until the surviving soldiers fled, screaming. while millions of viewers around the world watched the battalion swell with new recruits in real time. And when the fog lifted, the reviewing stand was empty, generals and ministers erased as though they had marched willingly into ranks that had no end. That moment broke the illusion of control forever, for now even governments could no longer deny what was happening, though they still refused to name it, speaking only of anomalous conditions and unexplained phenomena, while citizens knew the truth in their bones, for every night they heard the cadence on their streets, every morning they checked their photographs to see which faces had shifted, which names had been added to roles that should never have existed. Scholars began to argue not about whether the battalion was real but whether history itself had ever been stable, whether the world they remembered was only the latest draft of a story being rewritten endlessly by the march, and if so, how many versions of themselves had already been erased without their knowing. How many futures swallowed before they could arrive. Conspiracy forums grew into desperate communities, trading strategies on how to resist the pull of the fog, some covering their windows in salt, others sleeping with boots by their beds so the march would not drag them barefoot into the mist, while others embraced the inevitability, carving cadence counts into their skin, declaring that the battalion was not a curse but a return to some eternal order. And those cults swelled with followers, their marches echoing at night until police dispersed them, though sometimes the cultists were gone by morning without a trace, their footprints leading only into haze rising from cracks in the pavement. And yet the most chilling development came not from cults or governments but from the sky itself, for satellites began transmitting fractured images of whole cities veiled in unnatural mist, their streets rearranged into grids that matched no maps, their buildings blurred, replaced by outlines of tents and cannons, as though the fog was not content with men but now consumed landscapes, dragging entire regions into the shape of a war long finished yet never ended, and those images terrified even the most powerful, because it meant the battalion's march was not simply recruitment but conquest, not only stealing soldiers from the living but rewriting terrain, bending the world itself into its campaign ground, until there would be no past and present, only an endless battlefield, stretching horizon to horizon, fog for sky, boots for thunder, a war with no enemy and no victory, only the march forever, swallowing every name, every face, every nation, until all that remained of human history was cadence on the wind and the faceless ranks of an army that began as one regiment lost in a forest and ended as everything. And when everything was cadence on the wind and faceless ranks without end, the world began to discover that it was not only space that bent beneath the march but time itself, unraveling in ways no scientist, priest, or historian could explain. For one dawn in a coastal city brought not the usual light of morning but the deafening roar of cannons that had not been fired in centuries, their blasts rattling skyscraper windows while smoke rose from nowhere, curling into the streets until terrified citizens found themselves staring at regiments in blue and gray exchanging fire across intersections where moments before traffic had flowed, bullets slamming into glass towers that shivered like water before snapping back into steel as though the present was fighting to assert itself against the intrusion. And then just as quickly as it appeared the battlefield was gone, leaving cars abandoned mid-road and commuters weeping, clutching their ears against the phantom thunder, certain they had witnessed not a vision but a collision of eras, the Civil War itself bleeding into their century. And soon similar rifts appeared everywhere. A farmhouse collapsing overnight only for archaeologists to uncover foundations older than the nation itself beneath its ruins. Or a child in Tokyo speaking in perfect 19th century Virginian dialect, recounting commands and roll calls with the precision of a veteran, though she had never left her neighborhood. And more disturbingly, records of entire towns shifted, archives rewriting themselves so that places believed to have been founded in the 20th century now appeared in documents as if they had existed since the 1700s, while others vanished from history altogether, erased as cleanly as the battalion itself once had been. Time grew brittle in the grip of the fog, and every clock near its presence stuttered, ticking backward for minutes at a time before resuming, while digital calendars corrupted, phones ringing with dates that did not exist, and people waking to find newspapers dated decades in the past lying fresh on their doorsteps, headlines declaring victories and defeats and wars long finished. As if the world was being rewritten page by the endless march, dragging the present into the mire of an unfinished campaign. Survivors who returned from encounters with the fog reported not only the endless road and faceless drummer but cities in ruins they did not recognize, landscapes alien yet familiar, as if glimpsing both the past and a future already lost. And many returned older than when they left, their hair gray, their bones brittle, though they had been gone only hours in our time. And one man vanished for an afternoon, but emerged with journals written in his own hand describing 50 years of service. Under banners that bore no nation's name, his entries filled with endless orders to march, to drill, to disappear into fog thicker than stone, and though his body crumbled into dust the moment researchers tried to separate him from the journals, the writings remained, impossible to disprove, and worse still, they seemed to grow on their own, new pages appearing each dawn as if the march continued still, the ink wet. The handwriting unmistakably his. This terrified scholars more than vanishings, for it proved the battalion was not bound to the past at all but spreading forward into futures not yet lived, dragging men and women into campaigns that had no beginning and no end, and soon people feared sleep more than death, for dreams themselves grew infected with overlapping centuries, one moment trench mud sucking at their boots in France, the next cobblestones of Richmond echoing with cannon fire, the next a blasted cityscape of twisted steel that had never existed yet bore the ruins of skyscrapers familiar to them, as though the march already marched beyond the 21st century into wars that had yet to come. Panic bled into daily life, for parents woke to find their children missing only to discover them hours later wearing clothes of eras gone by, speaking in voices that were not their own, calling out names no one recognized, and in some cases the children never came back, their forms fading at the dinner table as though stepping into another century mid-bite, leaving plates clattering to the floor, their families broken with grief and madness. Unable to explain what had taken them except that the march had claimed its due. Governments lost their grip entirely when even their archives betrayed them, treaties altered, leaders erased from history, maps redrawn by hands unseen, until no one could be sure which wars had been fought, which nations had ever existed, and whether their own lives were genuine or already borrowed from some vanished draft of reality. And whispers spread of researchers who insisted the battalion was not simply rewriting time but feeding on it, consuming whole decades to fuel its expansion. Every vanishing not just a body lost but a thread of reality pulled from the loom, leaving holes that had to be patched by fabric from elsewhere, no matter how ill-fitting, and the result was a world where past, present, and future bled together in grotesque harmony, a world where ancient drums beat in the same breath as sirens, where muskets fired across highways beside tanks, where faceless ranks stretched across centuries yet moved as one. And if there was ever doubt of this, it was erased during the event that came to be called the collapse of hours, when across the globe for 7 full minutes every clock stopped, the sun froze in the sky, and people saw streets around them dissolve into overlapping visions, Victorian carriages rolling beside armored vehicles, soldiers in bronze helms standing shoulder to shoulder with men in modern fatigues. Children with gas masks clutching muskets beside men carrying rifles not yet invented. All of them moving in cadence to the same endless drumbeat, their mouths silent, their faces blurred, and though the sun resumed and clocks ticked forward after those minutes, humanity was forever changed, for they now knew that the battalion was no longer a mystery or a haunting but a devourer of chronology itself, and no barrier of nation, belief, or science could resist its hunger. From that day on, entire philosophies crumbled, because if the march rewrote history, then memory itself was suspect, and if it consumed the future, then hope was meaningless, and in its place arose only the terror of inevitability, the certainty that all roads led to the same fog, the same boots, the same faceless ranks on an endless road, until individuality, nations, even centuries themselves would be erased. Folded into the cadence of an army that had no beginning and would suffer no end, a living monument to silence marching forever across the graveyard of time. Across the graveyard of time where the faceless army advanced, the world began to understand that it was not only chronology that bent and buckled but existence itself, as though the march had grown too vast to be contained within mere centuries and had now begun to press against the fabric of reality like a weight too great for glass to hold. And the cracks showed first in subtle ways, colors fading in daylight as though leached by fog even on clear skies, birds falling silent mid-flight and hanging motionless for seconds before resuming as if nothing had occurred, conversations repeating themselves in loops while speakers swore they had never said the same words twice, and then stranger ruptures appeared, entire blocks of cities flickering as if projected, their buildings phasing into shapes unfamiliar. Their streets bending at impossible angles before snapping back into form, leaving citizens nauseous and disoriented, clutching their temples as the air vibrated with the thunder of unseen boots. What terrified those who lived through these shifts was not just the distortion but the implication that their world was no longer solid, no longer certain, that reality itself had become a thin skin stretched over the endless march, and each day that skin grew thinner, each night the fog pressed closer, and sometimes when people looked into mirrors they did not see themselves but strangers in ragged uniforms, eyes blank, mouths moving in cadence. Their reflections marching away even as they stood still. Soon even the ground betrayed them, roads splitting open to reveal not asphalt or earth but the pale stone of that endless road glimpsed in dreams, stretching into horizons that shimmered with impossible light, and those who stumbled into those fissures vanished instantly, their screams cut short, their shadows swallowed by the drumbeat that rose louder than thunder. Entire towns disappeared without warning, one moment bustling with markets and schools, the next only fog swirling where their streets had been. And when outsiders tried to investigate they found nothing but silence, the land bare and featureless, as though the towns had never existed, their history erased from memory and map alike, and only the faint echo of boots remained, marching beneath the soil like a heartbeat of the world itself. Scholars, priests, and leaders alike collapsed under the enormity of it, their words hollow in the face of an erasure too vast to contest, and new cults arose in the ruins of faith, their members marching day and night through city streets, faces painted gray, chanting the cadence in unison, begging to be taken, until one dawn they all vanished together mid-step, leaving only footprints pressed deep into the earth, as though stone itself had softened to record their obedience. Even those who resisted felt the futility of defiance, for no weapon, no wall, no prayer slowed the fog, and the more humanity tried to name it, to define it, the more it shifted, until some whispered that the march was not an invasion but the true state of existence, that reality as humanity knew it had always been a thin disguise over the eternal road, and now the disguise was finally tearing away. Scientists who studied the anomalies found that fundamental constants were failing. Light no longer moved at fixed speed near the fog, gravity weakened in its presence, and time dilation became violent, seconds stretching into hours, hours collapsing into blinks, until entire laboratories vanished into experiments they had designed, their researchers found decades older or infants again when they stumbled out, before dissolving into dust. The battalion itself no longer appeared as individual figures but as a single wave of faceless humanity, a tide of gray uniforms and eyeless faces stretching to every horizon, their boots striking in such unison that mountains quaked, oceans shuddered, and stars themselves seemed to flicker as if caught in rhythm. Astronomers peering into telescopes saw fog blooming even in the skies, nebulae reshaped into columns, constellations bent into lines of march, and in horror they realized the phenomenon was not confined to Earth, for galaxies themselves showed strange patterns of erasure, clusters dissolving into uniformity, cosmic formations aligning as though the march had extended into the fabric of the universe, rewriting creation itself into cadence. Panic gave way to resignation as humanity felt its individuality thinning, thoughts repeating in drill-like monotony, dreams consumed entirely by the drummer boy's rhythm, until some woke with their feet already moving, compelled to march even against their will, their bodies jerking forward in spasms of obedience until they collapsed from exhaustion. Yet even in death their corpses twitched in rhythm to the drumbeat no one else could hear. Governments crumbled, borders dissolved, as no map remained stable, every line redrawn each morning into formations of regiments, until at last even language itself broke, words rearranging into chants, prayers into cadence counts, lullabies into marching songs, and humanity's collective memory shattered into fragments of order shouted across centuries. Yet the fog showed no malice, no mercy, only inevitability, the endless forward motion of boots that needed no destination, no victory, no reason beyond itself, and perhaps that was the greatest horror, that there was no enemy to fight, no war to win, only the march forever, consuming not just soldiers, not just cities, not just time, but the very idea of difference, of individuality, of history. Until all became one sound, one step, one road. And on the final day that the sky still held light, when the last human voices cried out for help, They were drowned by a thunder that had begun in a forest more than a century ago, a thunder that spread across centuries and worlds, until the universe itself folded into fog and boots and silence. And all that remained was the endless road, faceless ranks, and the eternal drumbeat, striking forever into nothingness. Striking forever into nothingness, the boots hammered forward, and in the haze of cadence and the blur of white silence one thought sparked inside me, faint as a candle in endless night, the realization that I was not only marching but remembering, not only moving forward in a line of faceless men but carrying a fragment of myself, a name, a past, though even as I reached for it the fog clawed at the memory, tearing letters from my mind, so that I whispered James, Joseph, Jonah, until the syllables scattered and I clutched only the echo of sound, yet still it meant something, because among thousands of eyeless faces I alone seemed to recall that once I had been more than a pair of boots, more than a step on the road, more than a shadow swallowed by fog. I tried to turn my head but my body moved in rhythm, compelled forward by a force deeper than bone, and everywhere around me stretched ranks of soldiers, their uniforms torn by time, gray and blue side by side though no one noticed, muskets melted into rifles, rifles into weapons I did not recognize, as if centuries had merged and collapsed into a single formation where history itself dissolved. And the fog above pulsed with the drumbeat, a sky made of sound that hammered not only into my ears, but into my chest, my heart beating with it, my breath exhaling in cadence, until I wondered if the drummer boy who set the pace was not somewhere ahead but inside me, an organ made of rhythm dictating my every move. Yet fragments returned in flashes, the smell of gunpowder, the scream of horses, the muddy field where we had once stood in line facing cannon fire, and the order that had driven us forward, a shout I could no longer name, and then the fog had come, rolling like a tide across the battlefield, swallowing sound, silencing screams, and from that moment onward the march had never ended, though years, decades, centuries passed beneath our boots, whole landscapes shifting, forests sprouting and dying, cities rising and collapsing, oceans retreating and flooding again, yet we did not stop, we did not break formation, we did not rest, we only marched, and somewhere along the way faces blurred, names faded, voices ceased, until I alone seemed to hold on to the thin thread of remembrance. I tried to speak, to whisper to the man beside me, but his mouth moved only in the shape of the cadence, silent and blind, his skin pale as smoke, his eyes sealed over like wax, and when I reached to touch him my hand passed through as if he were not flesh but echo, a shadow given weight by the rhythm of the march, and terror twisted in me, for I wondered if I too was fading, if the only thing anchoring me was the fragile act of memory. And once that broke, I would dissolve into the faceless ranks forever. The fog thickened as if hearing my thought, curling against my skin, pressing words into my ears, forward, 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 the command unending, the road stretching white beneath us with no stones, no dust, only blankness, and yet the sensation of ground beneath boots remained, steady as heartbeat, eternal as tide. I looked upward and saw no stars, no sun, only fog rolling into forever, yet sometimes in the shifting veils I glimpsed moments, streets I did not know, towers of glass, machines that roared like thunderbirds, children staring with fear from doorways as we passed unseen, and I realized we were not separate from the world but moving through it unseen, bleeding into it when the veil thinned. And each time we passed the living some were pulled into ranks beside us, uniforms draping across them in an instant, their eyes sealing shut, their mouths silenced, their steps falling into rhythm without resistance, and their memories dissolving until they no longer remembered who they had been, only where their feet must fall. I alone resisted, clinging to a name, to scraps of thought, to the image of a farmhouse on a hill where someone had once waited for me, though her face blurred, though her voice dimmed, though the fog gnawed at her until she became a smear of light in the haze. I marched and marched, years collapsing, centuries folding, until sometimes I glimpsed armies beside us, Romans with shields, Mongols on horseback, soldiers in steel helmets, men in digital camouflage, all of them faceless, all of them absorbed, their histories erased, their wars forgotten, their identities blended into the one battalion, the one march, the one drumbeat that had no origin and no end. And horror dawned on me with a clarity sharper than any blade. We were not a regiment lost in time, we were time itself, devouring those who believed themselves separate, dragging all wars, all armies, all centuries into a single file of endless boots striking a road that stretched beyond existence. Forward into nothingness, yet in that nothingness something shifted, a tremor in the fog like a ripple through glass. And for the first time since I had become aware of myself inside the faceless ranks, I saw not only the blankness ahead but cracks forming in its surface, thin jagged lines of light that pulsed like veins, and within them flickered sights so alien that my steps faltered even as my body tried to maintain rhythm. Because through one fracture I saw a stretch of field golden with wheat swaying in sunlight, through another I saw a city burning in silence, its towers collapsing inward without sound, and through yet another I glimpsed a vast black ocean beneath stars I did not recognize, and though the fog pressed against these fissures like hands smearing chalk from a slate, the images persisted, haunting me as proof that the road was not all there was. That perhaps beyond its endless cadence lay fragments of realities untouched by the march, places not yet consumed. The beat pounded harder as if to drown my thoughts, the drummer boy's arms a blur ahead of me, his sticks striking skinless drums that seemed stitched from the fabric of time itself, and every blow sent tremors through my chest until I gasped, fighting to remember the flickers of those worlds, to hold them in my mind before the fog erased them, whispering their shapes under my breath: sunlight, wheat, ocean, stars, repeating them like prayers while the faceless soldiers beside me marched. Without awareness, their sealed mouths moving only in silent cadence. The cracks widened when the beat stuttered, each falter revealing more, and though terror told me to look away, hunger drew me closer, a need to know if there was something beyond this endless forward motion, something beyond boots and road and silence. Once, through a fracture, I saw myself, not as I was now, a hollow uniform of skin and rhythm, but younger, alive, sitting on a porch in the glow of sunset, a child's laughter in my ears, a woman's hand on mine, her face blurred by fog but her warmth undeniable, and my heart broke with the recognition that I had lived once, that the march had stolen me from more than battlefield smoke, it had stolen me from life itself, from the fullness of being that now seemed like a dream barely remembered. I staggered, my boots striking off rhythm, and instantly the fog struck at me, tendrils wrapping my chest, forcing my body back into step, pain lancing through my skull as though the road itself would not permit disobedience. Yet even as agony racked me, the fissures persisted, calling me to look deeper. At first I thought I alone saw them, but then I noticed faint shudders in the ranks around me, tiny jerks of movement like men breaking pace for half a breath, their heads twitching toward the light before snapping forward again, and I understood with dread that memory was spreading, awareness like infection passing from one to another, each soldier recalling for a heartbeat that he had been someone once, that the fog had not always been his sky. And in that fleeting recognition the march trembled. The drummer boy struck harder, the cadence booming so violently that the cracks shrieked as if in pain, the light within them flickering, yet they did not seal, and in desperation I pushed my thoughts outward, whispering louder now, chanting the fragments I remembered: wheat, sunlight, laughter, hand in mine, words that felt like rebellion against the silence, and though no soldier turned his head their steps wavered, their rhythm faltered. The perfect harmony of boots breaking into uneven thunder, and for a breath the fog recoiled as if wounded by memory. In that instant one fissure burst wide, spilling not light but a flood of air, warm and filled with scent, the fragrance of earth after rain, the smell of grass, and I wept as it touched me, for it was the first true scent I had known in what felt like eternity, proof that the road was not all, that something beyond survived. My tears fell onto the white surface of the road, and to my horror the ground absorbed them greedily, the blank stone darkening where they struck, veins spreading outward like ink bleeding through paper, staining the purity of the march, and the drummer boy froze mid-beat, his eyeless gaze turning toward me for the first time, the silence deafening as thousands of boots halted in unison, the fog curling inward as though to smother the stain. And in that silence my own heartbeat thundered louder than any drum, defiance pounding through my chest. The boy's mouth opened then, a soundless scream stretching wide, and the fog surged against me, pressing cold into every pore, trying to erase the memory I clung to, but instead of releasing it I hurled it outward, shouting hoarsely into the white void: I lived once, I had a name, I loved, and though the fog clawed at every word, some part of it broke through, because soldiers around me stumbled, their eyeless faces turning as if straining to hear, their boots grinding out of sync, and the cracks in the fog blazed brighter, light flooding the road in jagged lines until it looked less like stone and more like glass splintering beneath too much weight. I realized then that the road was not eternal, that it could shatter, that perhaps if enough of us remembered, if enough of us resisted, the march could be broken, though whether what lay beyond was salvation or greater abyss I did not know. Fear screamed at me to stop, to yield, to fall back into cadence before the fog erased me utterly. But something stronger than fear drove me forward, and as the drumbeat resumed in a frenzy, faster than before, punishing every falter, I forced my steps out of rhythm, one beat behind, each disobedient stride like fire in my veins, each one echoing against the silence, a rebellion of one man against eternity. And when the drummer boy's eyes burned white-hot with fury, when the fog howled as though the universe itself resisted, I whispered my name, uncertain and broken though it was, a single syllable dragged from oblivion, and the cracks split wider at the sound, blinding light pouring through, and for the first time since the battalion had vanished from the battlefield long ago, I believed that escape might be possible. That beyond the endless march there was still something left to reach, though. Whether it was freedom or final ruin I could not yet know, only that I would keep whispering, keep resisting, until the road itself broke beneath our feet. Beneath our feet until the road itself broke, the silence shattered with a sound unlike any drum, a crystalline shriek that tore through the fog as the cracks burst outward like lightning across glass, and the white veil split apart in 1,000 directions, releasing blinding light that swallowed the ranks of faceless soldiers, searing away their edges until their uniforms blurred and their shapes dissolved like smoke, and though terror clawed at me, my body kept moving forward, pulled not by cadence but by the momentum of defiance, one boot thrust through the fracture, sinking into brightness so intense it felt like plunging into fire, yet instead of pain I felt weightless, as though the ground no longer mattered, as though the drumbeat had finally loosened its chains. And with a cry that was half sob and half roar I hurled myself through the widening fissure, breaking free of the road's grip for the first time in what might have been centuries. The light swallowed me whole, stripping away fog, stripping away rhythm, until I stumbled onto ground that was not stone but soil, damp beneath my knees, fragrant with the unmistakable smell of rain-soaked earth. And when I lifted my head I saw not blankness but a vast horizon of shifting landscapes, fields dissolving into mountains, cities blooming and crumbling in the span of moments, rivers surging forward then evaporating into deserts, as if every possible world was layered upon itself in chaotic motion, colliding and merging, all of history and future overlapping without boundary. I gasped at the sight, for it was beauty and terror entwined, and I realized this was what lay beyond the fog, not freedom, not salvation, but the raw, unfiltered storm of existence itself, a place where time had no order and reality no anchor, where moments cascaded in torrents, crashing into one another until the very air shimmered with contradictions, and I was but a speck caught in the flood. Around me fragments of other soldiers spilled through cracks, some collapsing to their knees in awe, others screaming as their bodies unraveled into shadows or aged 1,000 years in seconds, their forms flickering between youth and decay before vanishing altogether, swallowed by the storm. I clung to the thought that I had chosen this, that I had stepped through by will rather than compulsion, and that fragile belief anchored me as currents of light and shadow howled past, showing me visions too swift to comprehend, an empire rising in fire, a child carving symbols into stone, a future battlefield of machines clawing across ash, a woman whispering my name though her face remained hidden. And all of it tangled together until I could no longer tell if these were memories, prophecies, or hallucinations birthed by my desperate mind. Yet amid the chaos I felt something stirring within me, the faint thread of identity I had clung to through the march strengthening, a pulse of selfhood resisting dissolution, and with every breath I repeated the words that had cracked the fog: I lived once, I had a name, I loved, and though the storm tried to swallow them, though voices of 1,000 years screamed around me, the words echoed louder in my skull until they became a beacon, a tether binding me to being. I rose shakily, feet sinking into ground that shifted from mud to stone to glass with every step. And the fissure shuddered, the vision of the dark road flickering, though not vanishing. We had not destroyed it, but we had wounded it, proven it could be resisted, and the knowledge burned in us brighter than terror. The storm closed in again, furious, but we no longer cowered, for we had each other, and we had found the first crack in eternity's cadence. What lay ahead I could not say, whether we could scar the wound or be consumed by it. But I knew the march would no longer have us unopposed, that the endless road was not absolute, and that even in the heart of silence, resistance had found its voice. Resistance had found its voice, and though the storm surged back upon us with a fury like oceans overturning, though the fissure in the monolith still pulsed with visions of the Black Road, though the faceless legions marched unbroken in that depth, we no longer bent our heads to cadence but raised them to shout against it, and the very air vibrated with our discord, with songs clashing against chants, memories colliding into a thunder that was ours alone. And in that maelstrom of chaos I felt something shifting, not in the storm but in us, as if the very act of refusing to march was stitching our scattered selves back together, bones firming, eyes regaining light, scars closing as memory knit identity into strength, until those of us who had been hollowed husks only hours before now stood with shoulders square, voices strong, and for the first time since stepping into this nightmare I felt we were more than prey, more than echoes, we were a company reborn in defiance. Yet the march was not passive, and the storm shuddered as from the fissure poured shapes not faceless but broken, soldiers whose features flickered between identities, who screamed with voices stolen from countless centuries, their bodies patchwork of armor, rags, steel, and bone, as though the march had cobbled them together from fragments of those it had consumed, and they came at us not in cadence but in frenzy, wielding jagged weapons that dripped with a light thicker than blood. The clash was chaos, our defiance against its horror, and though fear rattled my bones I swung with fury, my weapon nothing but memory sharpened into form, a rusted bayonet that appeared in my hands because I willed it there. And when I struck it met not flesh but fog made solid, yet the scream that tore from the creature's throat was real, and it dissolved into shards that the storm devoured. Around me others discovered the same power, memories manifesting into tools. A centurion raised a shield embossed with his legion's eagle. A girl gripped the wooden handle of the doll she once carried and struck with it as though it were steel. An old woman brandished a torch that had burned her home and now burned the faceless abominations to cinders. And together our discord turned to battle, our memories weapons, our chaos a tide that pushed back the horde. But for every one that fell another clawed from the fissure, and behind them the drummer boy's hollow gaze never wavered, his stick striking bone with terrible precision, each beat summoning more horrors, each echo rattling our marrow as though it sought to drag us back into cadence. Our rebellion strained, bodies fell, voices cracked, and despair crept once more, until I remembered the valley itself, the monoliths etched with symbols deeper than words, and I cried out to the others, strike the stone, not the shadows. And together we turned our fury upon the carvings, our weapons crashing against the ancient markings until sparks flew not of fire but of memory, visions leaping from the stone like lightning, fields of wheat, children's laughter, the warmth of dawn across bare skin, thousands of lives pressed into the fabric of existence itself, each strike releasing fragments that joined our chorus. The storm recoiled with every blow, the fissure shuddering as though it could not endure the flood of raw living memory, and for a heartbeat I thought we had found the wound's undoing. Yet the march adapted, the drummer's beat shifting, faster now, irregular, like a heart in frenzy, and from the fissure crawled not soldiers but entire epics twisted into weapons, a cathedral that screamed as it collapsed upon us, a battlefield where arrows rained from nowhere, a city street aflame with gas and steel, the march hurling the weight of history itself against our defiance. We scattered, some crushed beneath visions too solid to be illusions, others vanishing into timelines not their own, yet those of us who remained pressed harder, voices hoarse but rising still, and I felt the chaos within me peak, the dissonance so sharp it was pain, but in that pain was freedom, and I hurled it outward in a scream that shook the valley, a scream of every memory I had clung to, every fragment of self I refused to yield. And it struck the fissure like a hammer. The drummer staggered, his beat faltering, his hollow eyes flickering with something I dared to call doubt, and in that falter the fissure cracked wider, spilling not more horrors but light, pure and blinding, as though we had torn through the shadow into something beyond. We shielded our eyes, trembling, and when we looked again the valley was gone, the monolith shattered, the fissure collapsed, and we stood upon a plain of silence so deep it ached, an emptiness without storm, without road, without horizon, as if we had stepped into the marrow of existence itself. Fear thickened in my throat, for silence had been our enemy from the first, but this silence was not cadence, not suppression, it was potential, raw and unshaped, and I knew with sudden clarity that the march had never feared our defiance. It had feared this, the place where silence could birth new rhythms, where memory could weave new patterns, where dissonance could become creation instead of destruction. Yet before we could test it, before we could shape a sound into this void, the drummer's voice at last spoke, not with words but with thunder that cracked through our skulls. You cannot win, for even here, I am. The march is the wound is eternity, and eternity cannot be slain. My body shook with the force of it, but I spat blood into the void and answered, then let eternity bleed. And I raised my weapon of memory high, the others following, our discord swelling once more, not as chaos now but as something sharper, something like a new song born from 1,000 clashing notes. And with a unified cry we struck the silence itself, daring to scar eternity, daring to write ourselves upon the marrow of existence. Daring to see if even the endless road could be remade. See if even the endless road could be remade was the thought that bound us as our weapons of memory struck into the marrow of silence, and the void rippled like water beneath the weight of our defiance, vibrations echoing outward in concentric rings that shimmered with colors never seen by mortal eyes, hues that pulsed between emotion and sensation so profoundly that I felt them not only in my vision but in my very bones. Each wave a clash of countless lifetimes condensed into rhythm, and in that instant I understood that we were writing not words but existence itself upon the emptiness. Every scream, every laugh, every tear we had held against the fog now hammering itself into a pattern that was ours, not the march's. At first the rhythm was chaos, staggering and uneven, voices shouting over each other, weapons clanging in mismatched tempo, but slowly, as though drawn by instinct deeper than memory, our discord began to braid together, not into cadence but into polyphony, 1,000 rhythms layered upon one another without drowning each other. A storm of difference made unity without uniformity, and the void shuddered with it. New forms blooming where once there was only silence, mountains birthing themselves from notes of rage, rivers flowing from sighs of grief, stars flickering awake from laughter spilled into the emptiness, until a new world was being woven before our eyes, fragile but real, pulsing with the defiance of those who refused to march. Yet as we marveled, as hopes surged that perhaps we had scarred eternity itself, the air split with the terrible reverberation of bone against bone, the drummer boy's sticks striking again, and from the nothingness poured not storm, not faceless soldiers, but the collapse of entire realities, universes unraveling into our fragile creation, their dying screams twisted into rhythm that tried to override ours. And I saw galaxies crack apart into shards that fell like meteors upon the world we birthed, cities collapsing before they could fully stand, oceans boiling into ash before rivers finished flowing, and at the center of the destruction strode the boy, no longer slight but vast, his body stitched from centuries, his eyes bottomless voids that bled cadence with every blink, and his sticks no longer bone but pillars of time itself, each strike sending tremors through our song until it wavered. Terror stole breath from our lungs, and many faltered, their memories unraveling back into fog, their weapons vanishing from their hands, their voices falling silent. But I screamed above the collapse, hold fast, hold to your fragments, sing them louder, make the world listen. And I thrust my bayonet of memory into the void again and again until sparks rained like meteors, and others followed, summoning torches, shields, dolls, swords, plows, books, every relic of life they had loved, and together we poured them into the rhythm, weaving faster, fiercer, our song rising against the march's thunder. The clash shook existence like titans wrestling, and for every star the boy's cadence extinguished, we birthed another from discord. For every mountain he shattered we raised 10 more from laughter and grief, until the void itself became battlefield and forge at once, collapsing and remaking in breaths too swift to count. Yet I felt the strain tearing at me, my voice shredding, my vision splitting as if my mind could not contain so many memories burning at once, and I knew the cost would be terrible, that to create against eternity was to bleed out one's very soul. Still, I refused to stop, for if the march went here it would not only reclaim us but consume all that might ever be, and I would rather dissolve into the storm than surrender. Around me others made the same choice, and I watched with awe and horror as a woman pressed her torch into the void so hard it fused with her arm, her body blazing into a pillar of flame that became a sun above us, her scream both agony and triumph as she vanished into light, and another man shattered his shield upon the drummer's beat, the fragments becoming moons that orbited our newborn world, his form dissolving into dust that fed them. And one by one sacrifices became foundations, until our rebellion was not only resistance but creation paid in cells. The drummer staggered under the rising light, his vast form cracking, yet with every fracture he grew larger, his sticks striking faster, until cadence was no longer sound but gravity itself, pulling at our bones, trying to force our limbs back into step, and many buckled, their bodies twitching in unison as if puppet, yet I crawled to them, gripping their shoulders, shouting their names if they remembered, screaming fragments of mine when they did not, forcing chaos back into their throats. Until they coughed free of the rhythm, until their eyes lit again. But each rescue drained me, each shout stealing more of myself, until I feared I too would vanish, until the fog pressed so near I could taste it in my lungs, until my knees collapsed beneath me and I fell upon the broken ground of our half-born world. The boy loomed above, shadow swallowing stars, his sticks raised for a final strike that would undo all we had woven, and I thought despair had won at last, but then, from the distance of collapsing horizons I heard a sound that was not ours nor his, a note clear and steady, either cadence nor chaos, but something in between, and I turned to see a child not faceless but radiant, stepping barefoot across the void. Each step leaving flowers where none had grown, his face strange yet familiar. His eyes burning not with hollow hunger but with memory brighter than suns, and though the drummer roared, though his beat fell like a hammer upon mountains, the child did not flinch but raised his own hand, striking no drum but his chest, and the rhythm that spilled forth was heartbeat, simple, fragile, but undeniable. The effect was instant. The fog recoiled, the cadence faltered, even our discord wavered, caught between awe and fear, for in that heartbeat lay something we had all forgotten, the balance between silence and sound, between chaos and order, between memory and oblivion. The boy screamed as cracks tore his form apart, his sticks splintering into shards of time, and the universes he had hurled shattered further, folding into themselves until they vanished into sparks that drifted harmlessly across the void. And in his collapse I felt not victory but revelation, that the march had never been an enemy outside us but a wound within, a scar of existence that fed upon extremes. And that only by remembering the heartbeat could it be bound. The radiant child turned to us, his smile sorrowful yet fierce, and whispered in a voice that echoed across creation, "Sing not only what you were, but what you will be." And with those words he dissolved into light that flowed into our hands, our weapons, our voices. And I knew then that the battle was not to end the march but to reshape it, to teach eternity itself a new rhythm, not cadence, not chaos, but life. Life, the whisper had said. And though the child's light had dissolved into us, though his heartbeat now pulsed faintly within my chest like a fragile ember barely kept alive in a storm, I knew that ember was no small gift but the key to something greater than survival, greater than rebellion, for it was rhythm unchained, not cadence that bound nor chaos that tore but a pulse that wove differences together. And as I staggered to my feet with blood drying on my lips and memory burning in my veins, I raised my hand and pressed it to my chest, letting the heartbeat echo out into the void, its sound soft yet undeniable, and one by one the others followed, palms against flesh, voices falling silent for the first time not out of suppression but out of reverence, listening as the rhythm of existence itself whispered between us. The void trembled at that sound, not violently as when we had screamed, but in a deep resonance, as though acknowledging something it had long forgotten, and for a fleeting breath I believed we had found balance at last, that eternity itself might bend and heal beneath the simple truth of a living beat. But the wound was not so easily scarred, and from the abyss where the drummer had fallen came a roar unlike any before, a roar that was not one voice but countless, every soul ever consumed by the march crying out as one, their pain and silence woven into a tide that tore the void open anew, and what emerged was no boy, no army, no storm, but the march itself unveiled, a colossal form without boundary or face, a wound-given flesh. Its body a rift of unending roads that split and rejoined across horizons, its veins rivers of faceless figures forever marching, its eyes abysses from which drumbeats poured like blood, and when it moved the very fabric of the void cracked beneath its weight. The sight drove many of us to our knees, terror splitting their voices into silence, but I forced myself to keep standing though my bones quivered, for I knew this was the final truth. The march was not an enemy to be slain but a scar written into the marrow of time, and if we could not reshape it now, it would consume all worlds past and yet unborn. The heartbeat faltered as the wound's roar drowned it, yet I pressed harder against my chest, willing the ember to grow, and I shouted until my throat split, "Hear me, all of you, do not give it silence, give it life." And my voice cracked, but the others followed, hundreds of palms beating against chests, hundreds of hearts pounding in unison, yet each to its own rhythm, a symphony of difference that rose like a tide, and together we poured it outward, into the void, into the wound, into the roads of faceless marchers who faltered for the first time, their steps stumbling as echoes of individuality rippled through them. The great form reeled, its roads fracturing, and with a scream that shook eternity it lashed back, hurling centuries as weapons, collapsing ages into spears of history, dinosaurs crashing through starships, plague fires devouring futuristic towers, oceans from unborn worlds drowning fields not yet sown, and every fragment struck like thunder, ripping holes through the fragile world we had begun to weave. Drowning voices and floods of annihilation. But amid the collapse we held the heartbeat, louder and louder, and when I fell beneath the tide of ash from burning futures I rose again because the rhythm pulled me back, because every beat from those beside me was a hand gripping my shoulder, a voice whispering live. And though our bodies bled and broke we refused to march, refused to silence, refused to let the wound dictate our rhythm. The colossal form shrieked, fissures tearing through its roads, faceless figures shattering into sparks that drifted free, and from those sparks memories returned, faces, names, fragments of lives long devoured, swirling around us like constellations until I wept to see them, for they were proof that nothing was truly lost, that even in silence echoes remained, waiting to be sung back into life. We reached for them, weaving them into our rhythm, each recovered fragment adding strength to the heartbeat until it was no longer ember but blaze, no longer fragile but thunder, and with one final unified strike we hurled it into the wound itself. The void convulsed, the great form splitting, roads tearing apart, rivers of marchers evaporating into light, and for a moment it seemed the march might shatter into nothing, its eternity broken by the simple truth of living rhythm. Yet as it collapsed, as its body dissolved into sparks that flowed into the void like rivers of stars, I felt something colder, deeper, a whisper that the wound could never be destroyed, only reshaped, and that though we had cracked its form it would linger as long as existence bore scars. Still, even a scar could be turned from silence into song, and as the void steadied, as the last echoes of the wound's roar faded into distance, we stood upon ground that felt solid for the first time, beneath a sky studded not with fog but with stars, each one a memory reborn, each one a voice freed from cadence, and though exhaustion nearly killed me, though many of us lay broken and fading, I smiled through blood and whispered the word that had begun it all, alive. Alive was the word upon my lips and the word that rippled across the field of survivors, hundreds of voices whispering it with cracked throats and broken bodies, yet in those syllables was a power greater than any drumbeat, greater than any silence, for it was proof that we had endured, that in defying eternity's cadence we had forged something new, and as we staggered together across the strange ground of this remade void, stars kindling above us like lanterns of memory, I realized the battle was no longer about survival but about choice, what world we would weave now that the wound lay raw and waiting, what future we would carve upon the scar of existence itself. The heartbeat still pulsed within my chest, steady as my breath, echoing in every survivor who had pressed palm to flesh, and when we gathered in a circle, weapons of memory clutched like relics of faith, we spoke not in shouts but in fragments, telling stories of who we had been, what we remembered, what we longed to become, and each fragment shimmered into the air, solidifying into shapes that floated like stars around us, until the void glowed with constellations of memory, each one unique, each one refusing the faceless march. Yet amid the beauty a shadow lingered, for though the great form of the march had dissolved into sparks, though its roar had fallen silent, the whisper I had felt in its collapse gnawed at me still, the certainty that the wound could never truly vanish, that cadence would return in some form. For scars do not disappear, they endure, and perhaps that was the truth of existence. That struggle was not to destroy the wound but to live with it, to resist its hunger with every breath, to keep singing. Even when silence pressed close. The others felt it too, fear stirring behind their triumph, and soon debate rose among us, voices arguing whether we had truly won, whether to attempt weaving a new world here in the void or to scatter into the universes beyond the stars now forming above, each choosing their own fate. Some longed to build, to bind themselves together into a people reborn. Others longed only to rest, to lay down their weapons and dissolve into the light. Still others burned with vengeance, swearing that if the wound ever stirred again they would be ready to meet it with fury, even if eternity itself was the cost. As they quarreled I stood silent, listening to the heartbeat, and in it I felt the truth. We were fragments, yes, broken by centuries of march, scarred by silence. But fragments need not be weakness. Fragments could be mosaic, difference could be strength, and perhaps our destiny was not to decide one fate but to live many, to scatter across the scar and weave countless songs into its silence. So it could never again devour us all as one. I rose, voice hoarse but steady, and I told them this. And though not all agreed, though some still clung to rage or despair, enough listened that when the time came, when the void itself began to tremble as if demanding our choice, we acted not as an army in cadence but as individuals bound by one heartbeat, each stepping forward upon their own path. The centurion walked into the stars of his empire reborn, seeking to carry memory of his legion into eternity. The woman of fire cast herself into the constellations of her burning home, becoming flame eternal that would never again be silenced. The boy with the doll vanished into a field of flowers that bloomed where none had been, his laughter echoing faintly as he dissolved into play. One by one they chose, scattering into the fabric of the scar, weaving themselves into the new rhythm of life. And soon only a handful remained beside me, weary souls too stubborn or too uncertain to leave. I looked to them, my brothers and sisters, in defiance, and I asked what road they wished to walk. But they only smiled through blood and exhaustion and said, "Wherever you go, we follow." And at that my chest tightened, for I had never sought to lead, never sought to be more than a man who refused to forget. Yet now, at the edge of eternity, it seemed I had become something else, the bearer of a rhythm not my own but born of all our voices. I turned my gaze to the horizon of the void, where stars flickered like beacons, and I saw not one road but infinite, each waiting to be walked. And though fear still gnawed at me, though I knew the wound would never fully vanish, I felt no compulsion, no drumbeat, no cadence. Only choice, fragile and terrible and beautiful. With a final glance at the remnants of my battalion, at the strangers who had become kin in resistance, I whispered the oath that had carried me through silence. I lived once, I had a name, I loved, and with that I stepped forward into the stars, the heartbeat pounding louder than any drum, and the void did not bind me but opened, vast and endless, a tapestry awaiting the songs of all who refused to march faceless. And so the night an entire Civil War battalion disappeared without a trace ended. Not in silence but in scattered voices that would echo forever, not bound to cadence but free to live, to fracture, to sing. Yet if eternity taught us anything, it was that endings were never final, for even as the last syllables of our defiance echoed into the scar and even as the stars kindled with the songs of those who had chosen their own fragment of destiny, I sensed the truth humming in the marrow of my bones. Stories do not end when voices scatter, they spiral outward, intertwining in ways unseen, and what we had unleashed in that moment of rebellion was not closure but a beginning, not the sealing of silence but the opening of infinite echoes, each one carrying forward like a ripple across oceans without shore. And as my feet pressed upon the starlit fabric of this newborn expanse, I felt the weight of all who had gone before, every soldier who had vanished into the void, every soul who had walked faceless down endless roads, all of them now watching through the stars. Their whispers fluttering like moth wings against my ear, reminding me that though we had broken cadence once, the march was patient, the wound eternal, and it would seek us again, wearing new masks, new rhythms, subtle as a whisper, loud as a storm, for the nature of scars is not to vanish but to demand reckoning again and again. And perhaps that was why we had been chosen, why an entire battalion had been erased from the known world. Not as punishment or accident but as seed, torn from the soil of history and flung into the dark where it might germinate into something the wound could not predict, into defiance that spread not through armies but through echoes, through memory, through the choice to be alive in the face of faceless eternity. The handful of survivors who had remained with me walked at my side in silence, each gaze fixed upon the horizons that shimmered with infinite paths, yet though they saw futures waiting, I saw shadows between them, roads where the stars did not burn, corridors of absence threading through the scar like veins of ink, and I knew those were the remnants of cadence, scars of scars, fractures where silence still lingered, waiting, hungering. When I spoke of this, they shuddered, for though we had resisted, though we had scattered, none of us could deny the dread that silence might someday bind us again. And so our march did not end but transformed, no longer a cadence imposed upon us, but a pilgrimage we chose, each step a vow to guard what we had birthed, to walk the scar not as faceless shadows but as keepers of rhythm. Days, if days they could be called, bled into one another, and as we wandered, fragments of other survivors found us, souls who had scattered into stars only to drift back, drawn by the heartbeat that still pulsed faintly within me, and our circle grew, no longer an army yet not wholly free of its shape, a constellation of wanderers who shared stories around fires that burned with memory itself. Flames flickering with the faces of lost comrades, laughter woven with grief, and in those moments we began to understand that what we had built was not victory but legacy, a thread that would weave itself into every world we touched, a warning to all who might someday hear the distant thrum of drums beneath their lives. Yet even as hope flickered, the void reminded us of its hunger. For one night, if night it was, the stars themselves quivered, and from the dark corridors where light had never bloomed came a faint but unmistakable sound, the echo of a drumbeat, distant yet relentless, as if testing whether we would falter, whether we would forget, and though fear rippled through us, though somewhat to hear it again, we did not march. We did not fall silent, instead we pressed palms to chests and answered with our own rhythm, hearts pounding loud enough that the void itself trembled in recognition, and though the drumbeat faded it did not vanish, it lingered like a promise, a reminder that the wound had not ended, that the faceless would rise again. But we no longer cowered, for we knew now that cadence could be broken, silence could be scarred, and life, fragile, fleeting, defiant, could endure even in the deepest abyss. And so we walked onward, not toward an end but toward an ever-expanding horizon, carrying the story of the night we vanished, carrying the heartbeat of a child who had given himself to remind us of life, carrying the certainty that history itself would remember us not as the faceless who disappeared without a trace, but as the voices who refused to be silenced, whose march became not obedience but song. And that psalm would echo until the end of all scars, until even eternity learned to listen.